Slide over and we'll go.
Well, yeah. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Lanae Erickson. I'm a senior vice president at Third Way. And because we know that everyone across the country is thinking right now about the Sweet 16, we decided to do this event right now. And I am not talking about basketball. I am talking about the 16 Democratic candidates that are currently running for president. That was as of this morning, but at the pace that we're going, we may have 2 or 3 more by the end of the panel, so just shout it out if someone announces during the event. So we still actually have 9 months until anybody starts voting in the Iowa caucuses. It's a very long time, and I think a lot of us are going to be trying to ascertain during that period what the heck are primary voters thinking, who are they likely to choose. So, thankfully, we have decided to get some numbers that'll start to pull back the curtain on that. And this is actually our first poll release event. We're going to be doing this quarterly until at least Iowa, which I'm sure will be decisive, and then we can all move along our way because we'll have a nominee. So I'm excited to just have some of these guests here today to talk about their insights, too, on what Democratic primary voters want. But I'm going to start with just a few key numbers from the poll. So we worked with David Binder Research to put together a poll of national Democratic primary voters. And what we found, some of this has been reported by a lot of other polls, but some of it is a little bit new. So we asked them, what are they looking for in a candidate? And very similar to the polls that you've seen all over the country, most people say that what they want is to beat Donald Trump, overwhelmingly. In our poll, when said, are you looking for somebody who is really going to match your policy preferences? Or are you looking for somebody who has the best chance of beating Donald Trump? Which of those is more important to you? 2/3 say that they're more focused on beating Donald Trump. We've seen that over and over again. What was even more striking in our poll was it was higher among strong Democrats. So it's very clear right now, Democrats want to win. They're very focused on winning. And so then we asked them more about what that means. What do you think we actually need to do to beat Donald Trump? We said, do you think that you want a candidate who can appeal to a broad coalition of people, including some of those folks who maybe voted for Donald Trump in 2016? Or do you want to focus on energizing the left and progressives by going to the left? And overwhelmingly, these are primary voters. They say 7 in 10 want a broad coalition in order to win. And we actually broke down folks who had protested during the Trump administration, the folks that we say are the resist voters. 67% of them say we need a broad coalition rather than going left. So pretty united that we should be talking to a lot of different people and want a candidate who should talk to a lot of people. So there's been a lot of talk in DC about things like shifting the Overton window, right? Moving the national conversation. But when we asked Democratic primary voters whether they would rather have a candidate who addresses urgent problems that people are feeling today or shifting the national conversation, 8 in 10 picked urgency and action and addressing kind of kitchen table issues right now over kind of a faculty lounge debate about the Overton window. And that was clear among women, among people of color. They're really united on this point. We also asked them, what kind of issues do you think Democrats should focus on in order to beat Trump? And overwhelmingly, this really echoed what we saw in the midterms. People said reducing the cost of health care. That was the #1 issue in order to beat Donald Trump, which he's obviously helping us with this week. And that was about double the number that said Medicare for all or single payer was what should be focused on in order to beat Trump. The #2 answer was actually reducing taxes on the working and middle class. So real kind of kitchen table issues. And my favorite finding from throughout the poll was just how different what you might call the Twitterati was from the rest of the Democratic primary electorate. So I think a lot of us who are on Twitter throughout the day are thinking this is what primary voters are, right? This is a small group of voters, but it's representative of at least primary voters, if not the general electorate. But that is not what we found throughout our poll. So we asked how often folks posted on Twitter. 10% of Democratic primary voters said they posted on Twitter once a day or more. Only 10%. So 90% of the primary voters aren't posting on Twitter. And what we saw was a really big divergence across a lot of different questions on the poll on attitudes between that 10% and the other 90% of the folks who are actually going to choose the nominee. So just a couple of my favorite stats. The vast majority of primary voters want to build on the ACA, not necessarily move to a new single-payer system. But amongst the Twitter folks, the Twitter primary is tied on that question. So real divergence. Even starker differences on issues like the federal jobs guarantee. On abolish ICE, do you want to abolish ICE? The Twitterati is +3 on abolish ICE. But the 90% of primary voters who aren't on Twitter are down 34 on abolishing ICE. So huge distinction there between what we're hearing on Twitter and where those primary voters are. And finally, 2 times as many of the Twitter primary folks called themselves a Democratic socialist. It was only about 25% overall in the sample from the Democratic primary. So I'm going to stop there with the numbers and bring in these smart folks who have seen lots of other research in numbers too to help us disaggregate this and figure out what's going on. So I'm not going to go in order here. I'm going to jump around. Oh, actually, I am in order because you sat exactly where you were supposed to be. That's so perfect. So Dan Sena, down here on the left, is the master architect of the 2018 Democratic takeover of the House. He was the ED of the DLCC, but now he has co-founded a new firm, Sena Kozar Strategies, with Scott Kozar, another very, very smart political strategist, and they're going to help Democrats win at all different levels. Jessica Post, next to him, is the executive director of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, the DLCC. She and her organization have, since Donald Trump was elected, flipped 400 state legislative seats and 8 chambers. And she's become a bit of a sensation in Democratic politics because I feel like Democrats after 2016 realized state legislative races mattered. And then they were like, who does that? The answer is Jessica. Next to Jessica, we have Matt Morrison, who is the executive director of Working America, which is a 3 million member labor organization. Matt has worked on 400 elections over his career at all different levels. And with his work at Working America, the American Political Science Association has called it the bedrock of experimentation in American politics. And he's really focused on driving towards a fair economy for the working class. He also has some presidential campaign experience, which hopefully he'll bring to bear here. So I'm really excited to have these folks as well as our poll architect. So in from the beach today, one-day only appearance in Washington, D.C. We have David Binder, who is the founder of David Binder Research. He has 2 decades of experience, and I have always known him as a master of kind of qualitative and deeper research of what's really going on with the electorate. It's something he did for President Obama and has done for countless Democrats, really trying to dig under the quantitative numbers and see what's going on there. So I'm going to invite these folks to engage each other, have a conversation, rather than me just kind of going down the line and asking you. But I want to start with kind of an open-ended question I'd love to get all of your reactions to. We've seen these polls over and over again that say Democrats prefer beating Trump to anything else. Whatever you put on the other side of that question, they say beat Trump. What do you think that means? What do they mean by that? What should we take away?
Well, I think the perception of what it takes to beat Trump is pretty subjective. Yeah. And I was reflecting, I was on the Gephardt campaign in 2004 as an organizer, so I talked a lot to Iowa caucus attendees. And I just think it's based on your own framework of what you think might beat Trump, right? So I'm from the Midwest, so I grew up in a middle-class family. So for me, I think what will beat Trump is somebody that has a compelling economic story, a story of who's able to articulate that healthcare and economic hardship that they may have felt in their family, and to be able to communicate that effectively along with a narrative of what they think America should be. In 2004, a lot of caucus attendees felt, because of the Iraq war after 9/11, that somebody with military experience was the person that would do it. And so that's why John Kerry was such an appealing candidate. And he drove that narrative. And then obviously some of that was stripped from him with the Swift boat veterans and those sorts of things that happened in that cycle. So I think that this is certainly like a subjective question based on who you think can win in the battlegrounds. And for me, I think the thing that I just don't have a handle on, and that Dan and Matt may have, and David certainly may have more of an understanding, is the California primary electorate, because I think the importance of that is new to all of us. And I'm not sure that I certainly don't have a good sense of how the California electorate will function, or what things, right? Or what they'll value. I know that we work with the legislature there. The legislative leadership is very progressive in the legislature. I don't know that equals the primary electorate, though.
Do others want to jump in? What does it take to beat Trump?
So, hi, thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yes.
Thank you.
I should have led with that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Lanae. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Third Way.
Thank you.
And look, we should start off by saying Third Way was a great partner with us at the DCCC. Like, last cycle, we had healthcare 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, as many times as the Republicans could drop the ball themselves. And Third Way was there really helping us figure out a lot along the way. And then we had Tax Fight 1.0, and Third Way was a huge partner with us on that. So just big kudos, and it's just thank you for thinking of me today. Look, one of the things that we found most interesting, one of the big questions we had going into 2018 is what type of candidate on the congressional side are all these primaries going to spit out? And what are we going to produce? And it's sort of like the tail of the tape was like, okay, if you're African American, Hispanic, or a woman, you're going to make it through the primary. Well, that is true for the most part. But what is sort of under that, and I think what is more important, is every single one of those candidates, it's a little bit of a cliche in politics, but they truly did fit their district. In more moderate Orange County districts, the candidate that got sort of elected in the primary was the candidate that actually was the best general election matchup. We saw that throughout the country. There were a record number of women that ran, so there were a record number of women that made it, but there was no ideological chain or sort of framework that held them all together. They weren't all single payer. They weren't all, populist tax folks. Like, there was no individual thing. And even now, I don't know if you pay attention to the caucus now, it's a little bit of all over the place, just a little bit. Pelosi's doing a great job, but it's hard. There is no ideological framework that holds them all together. They're fairly pragmatic, fairly centrist folks that represent fairly pragmatic centrist districts. So I think what it ultimately means, I couldn't agree more with Ms. Post, who, by the way, has won more elections than anybody in the last 2 years in the United States. So it's cool to be on stage with her. But it is what that ultimately looks like is exactly what Post said. It's going to be up to those individual voters and what that looks like to them.
Just to jump in, first of all, Jessica Post is always right. So start from that, and you're really not going to be wrong. I love this observation that how subjective it is, because when you look at what primary voters tell us, it confirms more or less what you found in the research. But there's an additional twist. When we talked to around 500,000 voters a year face-to-face, and the sense that we're getting from folks in battleground states in particular, when we talk to Democratic primary voters, is that 2 out of 5 think Donald Trump is going to win re-election. So people are scared, expletive-less. And, but people are also, like Iowans in particular, are really colorful folks. There's this one woman, Lisa from Cedar Rapids, who explained to us, I'll vote for anyone who will beat that orange-haired maggot. Or Tom, a retired firefighter, who says he's a blankster, poopster, but he gets things done. Like, we really have to, I think, grapple with the fact that even within the Democratic electorate, I think 6% of the sample here said they vote for Donald Trump. His strength is far more robust than any of us can truly appreciate when you get down to the ground.
And I agree with my colleagues, all of them on the stage here.
That Jessica's awesome? Okay.
One thing that is, that we found when we did our qualitative research is that it's true that what it takes to beat Donald Trump is in the eyes of the beholder. And in some of the focus groups that we did, we heard people differ on whether that meant a demographic appeal, with some people saying it had to be someone other than a white man to beat Donald Trump, to energize the base and to get people out. So we had to be a woman or a person of color. And we had other people that said, no, you need we don't want to turn off that center, and maybe we need a white man this time, a senior statesman white man along the lines of, whatever, Biden or all the white men. But what I think it means when we ask people, like, why is it, or the question is, how will the issue of them looking for someone who can defeat Donald Trump affect their vote in the primary? And I guess we can easily say that we don't expect Andrew Yang or Marianne Williamson to be a spoiler, because people aren't going to throw away their vote for someone that they don't think can go on, win the nomination, and defeat Trump. So they're going to be looking at a candidate who does have appeal. And that's a little bit different than previous cycles, in which there were more people saying, I'm going to vote for the person that gets in my heart, or that I connect with, or that I resonate with. Now they really are going to be looking at someone who can go into a general election and beat Trump, because that is foremost in their mind. So they may even be watching these polls, if I dare say, to see who it is that is most likely to be able to beat Trump in a general.
Can I ask David a question?
Yeah, please.
Hey, it's a conversation.
That's right.
I love the question that you have in the poll that asks voters to rank who they think is the strongest candidate against Trump. Obviously, Biden comes out on top, but amongst the announced candidates, Bernie Sanders, which was not what I was expecting to see, given some of the other responses. What's going on here?
Well, I think Bernie has a very committed base of people who are looking at him as the solo candidate that they are behind him. He has his supporters from last time. They're not, if you look at the number of people who said they voted for Bernie in 2016, the primary, he's only getting about half of them this time, and maybe even a little less than half, like 40% of them. So a lot of people who voted for Bernie against Hillary, when obviously there were only 2 or 3 choices, mostly 2 choices, now are looking around at other candidates, and they're looking at some of the new faces, and whether it's Beto or Mayor Pete or Kamala or others, but there is still a very strong, committed core of those Bernie people who say that he is our guy, and they're sticking with him to the point where he's second in the polls now behind Joe Biden.
And a lot of that, at least if you take out the people that said, I don't know, there was a lot of name recognition going on. And I was just talking to somebody who said Bernie Sanders actually has higher name recognition in California than Kamala Harris. So everybody knows who he is, right? Yeah. And a lot of the polls that you see where you give people multiple choice right now, primary voters will say Biden and Bernie are their 1 and 2. And there's not a lot of ideological overlap there. I don't think that's an ideological decision. It might be the 2 they've heard of. So I wonder how that all is going to kind of move around. But it does go to the point that what is going to beat Trump is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. And you think whatever your thing is you like might be the thing that is also going to beat Trump. And certainly the Bernie folks make that same argument. I think based on the midterms, I think it hasn't really come to fruition, but they're certainly going to continue to make that argument, and they're saying they can win even in places that other people can't. So you all see a lot of data and talk to a lot of people. What surprised you from the numbers in this poll?
I think just one of the biggest surprises is that voters are actually, and maybe we just didn't have the foresight to ask it. We didn't ask the question about electability a lot last cycle. We asked a lot about bio. We asked a lot about sort of best foot forward, what actually moved the electorate. But we didn't do a lot of research where we just specifically said, do you want a candidate who can win or not, right? We asked questions about, do you want to check on Trump? Do you want somebody who'll work with Trump? We spent most of our time trying to figure out how to navigate through these Trump districts. I think it's really cool as a party that we now have Democrats across the country who sort of sit up and say, you know what, I actually want to win. Because I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room. After 2016, like the one thing we didn't get is we didn't get to win, and I think that has left, especially for operatives, the ghosts of Christmas Past early on in 2017 were very strong for all of us. Let's be honest, who wasn't on the edge of their seat going into the Virginia governor's race, right? Post was fortunate that she had early warnings, early specials, but I just think it's great as a party we have Democrats who are now saying, no, I want to win this time.
Yeah. I think the thing that I would add is I was surprised, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, about just the lack of name recognition among so much of the field. And so for me, and I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists, I wonder how soft that made the support. Warren actually had stronger recognition than I expected. I thought that Booker might have the same level of recognition as Warren just because of the amount of time he spent in the States. So I was surprised by that. And I also, one thing that I always think is that Democratic primary support is always so soft, and that people can be taken by other candidates pretty easily. This is a lesson I learned on the ground in Iowa. So the hard way, I would say. So I think I'm just interested to just in terms of other folks' take on the data, what you thought about just the lack of recognition and how soft that support for a Biden or a Bernie might be once people get to know the other candidates a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll say I don't know if I would say I was surprised by the finding, but I was really interested in the Twitterverse comparison. It's really easy to get swallowed up by the bubble of talking to each other. And whether it's actual general electorate voters or primary voters, it kind of rings true that folks aren't paying that close attention to this Sweet 16 instead of the other one.
Yeah, and I would just say on that we, from some of the other work we're doing, we're seeing increased interest in some of the first 4 states, but maybe not as much nationally so far. But, this is very fluid, and, and I think the question on Bernie and his base, when we did a little work and asked people kind of, are you open to other candidates? Is there anyone you've already ruled out? And, to determine kind of who has room to grow. And it really does appear that there's a lot of interest in a lot of candidates. And people like Biden and Bernie have less room to grow. People know who they are. They're kind of already with them. But there's a lot of interest in the rest of the field. And I know we're in late March, but a lot could happen. And I do think it's soft. But people are genuinely interested in the candidates and very positive on quite a bit of that roster.
So a lot of folks are talking about who we need to win in order to win both the general election and the primary in different states. If you got to only see one crosstab from this poll, and that was the one you got to track, the one demographic of voters through the rest of these quarterly polls, what one would you pick as kind of a bellwether or that we should be watching for the rest of the year?
Well, I'll jump in first. I think because this is a primary sample, I'd focus on black women. Black women are so animated in terms of, if you look at Obama's performances and just about any Democratic success story, not to say that they're singular as the cause for Democratic electoral success, but if you have a hyper-engaged black female electorate, and that does speak somewhat to Kamala Harris's prospects, then that's going to show up in the general election in a way that I think is going to be really valuable.
I couldn't agree more. You cannot become president of the United States. You cannot win the nominee without African-American women. It's just impossible to do. I couldn't agree more. It's really smart. Yeah, I really agree.
I agree with that. The other thing I would add is, and I alluded to this earlier, is I'd be interested in Nevada and California and which candidates were playing well in those states. The question about Kamala versus Bernie's name recognition, I think, is really interesting. I'd also be interested if Julian Castro was picking up support in some of those states as well. So those are, I think what we've seen is some of the early pieces of organization at the state legislative level. For example, Senator Booker was making a lot of contributions, stumping all over Iowa. So was Senator Warren. So we saw, I think, early support. You'd go into a staging location in Iowa, and both Amy Klobuchar and at that time Martin O'Malley, who is everywhere in 2017 and 2018, would be there kicking off a door knock. So that's, I think, part of the reason I was surprised that there wasn't as much support, because of all the activists that were sort of going in and out, and that those activists may not be truly representative of the full complement of primary voters in these states.
We've talked a little bit about the kind of Twitterverse versus the primary, and the candidates that ran in state legislative races and the candidates that ran in House races and Senate races last year and specials have all had to navigate this. What's your advice on that? How do they deal with that? Because there's so much attention to how the Twitterverse is reacting to every word someone says in real time, and that can be very attractive to react to and orient towards. And yet we know now at least 90% of the primary electorate isn't even on Twitter. So how do you all advise people to deal with that?
Look, I also think the debates are going to make it worse. I mean, as everybody knows, starting in June, you basically have a playoff game every month. And so I think it makes it worse. Look, I just think campaigns need sort of a dual track, one that 75% of your attention goes towards, with all due respect to Twitter, actually winning, and then you've got sort of this small social team that pays attention to how to put out fires. But look, a big part of this is just like the way you mobilize and organize now has changed, right? It used to be knocking on doors, talking to voters is really important, but like scaling your volunteers, so like you've got 1,200 followers, you've got 500 followers, you've got 600 followers, the three of you together actually have the ability to talk to more people, and geographic bounds don't matter anymore. So I just think it really is the way. Thank you for volunteering. I think it just changes the way you mobilize and organize along the way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly at the state legislative level of the ballot, we tell our candidates to just put their heads down and go out and knock doors and tell their personal story, and that's what's most appealing. We see some limited, like, I guess, bot activity and some of the other things that have been troubling in terms of social at the state legislative level of the ballot. But I certainly think the thing that we would tell that I would say is just, focus on the voters, focus on the electorate. And then do your best to sort of monitor maybe the hostile activity on that platform, and then amplify your supporters' own efforts on that platform on Twitter. Yeah. But it's not, we always say to our candidates, we're like, Twitter is not message guidance. Our DLCC Twitter is not intended as message guidance for anyone.
Good to know that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, you can't have two better people to tell you what candidates should and shouldn't do than these two. I will say that there's a couple of things that we see as you think about the general election, which is part of the calculation here. I always say that in order to win the center, you actually go left. And what I mean by that is that we have this misunderstanding of kind of a left-right spectrum or a centrist progressive spectrum. And really, as the Twitterverse observation points out, this is a paying attention, not paying attention divide. And so when you start to get real practical with folks, you see weird things. We just fielded a survey in a Northern Virginia district that you may be interested in, Jessica. And we asked, how much would you be willing to pay in taxes every month to fund teacher salary increases? And the average Republican was willing to pay $19 a month more in taxes. Who saw that coming, right? But I did want to just get back to, I wanted to circle back on kind of what we'd like to see in subsequent surveys. I want to see a crosstab based on contribution history. Are these folks small dollar contributors, activists, et cetera, and other indications of how truly engaged they are?
I think just with regard to the question on kind of paying attention to Twitter, the observation that I'd like to make here is that or let me give an example. Last night, Donald Trump went to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and did a rally. There's some discussion that Donald Trump kind of needs that kind of adulation that he gets from his base when he goes to places like wherever he goes. But, the people that show up
like
there are just
literally anywhere he goes.
He does this all the time. And Donald Trump, appears to relish those rallies, and he has a ego boost clearly. And I'm not going to go into the psychoanalysis of Donald Trump right now, but it's the same kind of concept. Donald Trump spends a lot of time talking to his base, appealing to his base. He doesn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out ways to expand his base. And I bring this up as a point because I think it's kind of the same thing with all the rest of the campaigns, because if you pay attention to the people who are at your rallies, I mean, maybe not so much for the Democratic primary voters because they're getting some pretty good questions when they go to these small events and town halls, but you really have to pay attention to the general electorate and see what they want. And for people to pay too much attention to Twitter or too much attention to the people that show up at your rallies, you're going to be misguided because you're not going to be able to reach beyond those people who already are there that that already are in your base.
We've had a lot of conversation already in the short primary time about labels, right? There's people being asked, are you a democratic socialist? Are you a capitalist? Are you a moderate? Are you pragmatic? So we tested a lot of those, and the worst testing one was democratic socialist, which did even worse than centrist, which kind of shocked me personally. But, there were some surprises there. Progressive did very well, liberal did pretty well, but, pragmatic did pretty well on favorability amongst Democratic primary voters, to your point about getting things done. And moderate actually did almost as well as progressive. So what do we take away from that? It seemed like kind of a jumble to me of numbers, but I'm curious if you all can disentangle them a little bit.
Yeah, let me just start off on that just because we've done a little bit of polling and looked at what these labels mean. And I thought there was some really interesting, when you ask about surprises, one of the biggest surprises that I felt after looking at the data that came back from this survey was the degree to which these labels are fluid and the degree to which they are not mutually exclusive. And we've done a lot of work just as pollsters looking at the difference between someone who calls themselves progressive versus someone who calls themselves liberal. And there's quite a bit of difference. There's a real chasm there. But I also think that a lot of us fall into a trap of trying to immediately define the electorate into one of those four categories, when in reality they're not. I mean, a lot of the people that call themselves progressive also call themselves moderate. We found that in this poll, which was really interesting, that it's, the idea that we just have a spectrum and everybody fits into a neat box in one point or the other from left to right, and that's where they are. I think that's a real misnomer, and it does a disservice for us understanding the electorate, who is much more complex, liberal on some issues, moderate on others, progressive on some, and some people just reject the whole linear liberal, progressive to conservative spectrum.
I don't know how meaningful these labels are. I guess I would say I think there's a lot of people that would say they're pragmatic, centrist, progressives, like in the same sentence. So I do think these things are definitionally different, probably by region as well. I also think that Americans don't necessarily completely understand the definition of socialism and what things sort of are and are not. So I guess I don't. I think I'd be much more interested in where some of the folks stand on specific policy positions, like if they embrace the Green New Deal, if they, I don't think we're going to ask anybody if we're going to turn the means of production over to the state, like in a poll, right? Like in the United States,
we're
but like,
that question
yes. But I'd be much more interested, I think, to see some specific issue breakdowns to be able to categorize people than necessarily their self-identification around a specific term.
Dan,
it just sounds like Democrats to me, to be honest.
You'll take any of the Democrats?
Well, it just sounds like,
Yeah.
you ask a Democrat how to classify something, you're going to get 40 different answers. So we're still Democrats, it sounds like. Yeah.
They also don't always identify as Democrats, right? You're like, well, are you a Democrat? They're like, oh, I'm an independent. And then you look at their voting history and you're like, you voted in like 8 Democratic primaries.
You're like,
They're
you're mine. Yeah.
Yeah, I vote for the candidate. It's always a Democrat, but I vote for the candidate. So we also have a problem, I think, sometimes with some of our base in this way.
That's So obviously, you talked about the importance of issues. Obviously, healthcare is going to be a huge issue in this primary, and in the general election, likely if Donald Trump keeps shooting himself in the foot, which I hope. But that's also where the focus was on the midterms. What are some lessons that we can learn from the great outcomes that we had about talking about healthcare and particularly navigating that primary and then general sequence with an issue that people care so much about?
Well, first of all, I was about to compliment you, Dan. I don't think you guys get enough credit for the diversity of wins that took over the House. There was this kind of simplistic analysis that the Senate is one battleground and the House is a different battleground, but a good chunk of these House seats navigated this exact question. When we look at our own data going back to 2012, what we're seeing is that the share of voters, even when you control for partisanship, who say their top concern is healthcare affordability, has about tripled in that time period. And if you're a healthcare voter, then regardless of your partisanship, you're more inclined to vote for the Democrats. So leaning in to those types of economic need questions makes all the sense in the world, especially when you think, wow, no one's gotten a raise in 45 years. So the rising cost of healthcare is a very practical kind of in-your-face thing. Democrats are going to need to expand the playing field in terms of issues, for sure. You're going to need to motivate the base. You're going to need to be more than just the one-trick pony. But start with the thing that works and lean in there.
Yeah, look, if I was guiding a presidential race right now, or if I could just talk to all the candidates, I would worry less about the specifics of healthcare, and I would just talk about the value of healthcare, which is really what we saw in most of our primaries, right? The fight over prescription drugs, the fight over pre-existing conditions, we'll take that all day long. And I think what ultimately ends up coming, if I had to pick sort of the slate of what we learned from 18, pre-existing conditions and just affordable healthcare, period. The corruption piece in Washington, D.C. and what is here. And Trump does a very good job of playing both sides of this issue, but cleaning up Washington, D.C., the corruption pieces here, and then to your point, paychecks. If I had to guess, those are the three big buckets, right? Access to affordable health care and all things that fall underneath it, paychecks, and then ultimately cleaning up Washington, D.C. I think whichever candidate can sort of master that and argue it from a values perspective, especially in the primary, I think will be the nominee. So.
I totally agree with Matt that Dan's candidates did this really effectively. And I think the thing that they did, instead of talking about putting up just a ad with a bunch of buzzword, and they're not really buzzwords, but like just an ad about like pre-existing conditions, healthcare affordability, was telling their actual healthcare story. Yeah. So it was, so I think that was a very effective thing. Yeah.
Well, I agree with that. When we talk to voters around the country, and certainly voters do care about big issues like climate change and things that are up the road a bit, and even today as we see climate change effects impacting people today. But what really matters is like what's going on in their life right here every single day, and they are really very focused on what's going to make a difference to me. And I have to tell you, in all the stuff that we did before 2018, the idea that they could lose insurance because they have a pre-existing condition was incredibly frightening to voters. Everyone, it seemed like nearly everybody we talked to, if they didn't have a pre-existing condition themselves, someone in their family did or someone they knew did. And the idea that Donald Trump could go out right now and say, we're going to repeal Obamacare, we're going to support the court case to repeal Obamacare before they have something to replace it with, that's got to frighten people, because all these people who either have health care or Medicaid expansion or have a pre-existing condition, they are scared. And this is the sort of issue that plays to Democrats, because it affects them in their day-to-day life for the people that they know.
Well, I think it's that fear, and I'm sorry, I hope I'm not jumping in on Dan or on Matt, but that fear of coming home and realizing that your kid has leukemia, or that your mom has a $50,000 medical bill. And I think those are the anchoring moments in a lot of our lives as Americans, is that feeling of sitting in. I mean, I think certainly in my life, like I sat in the hospital and filled out the forms when my grandmother had a $125,000 hospital bill, and there was no way that she could pay it. And at that moment, she was trying to figure out, like, do I still want to live if I have all of this? This is before the Affordable Care Act, all of this healthcare related debt. Like, those are the real things that Americans think about, right? And, she went on, we figured it out, but that was was she going to lose her home over that healthcare debt? And I think we need candidates who can tell the story that I just told in that same way about members of their family, and not just like, I just met with Eugene in Utah County and he said this, but really like in a authentic way about people that they fought for in their Senate office or as governor, et cetera.
I will also say I think this is Trump's kryptonite. I do think authentic, real storytelling and coupled with a candidate's strong bio, again, very basic 101 political stuff that we all learned in our early days, I do think is his kryptonite, though. That and getting to his motives as to why he does what he does, which is a whole nother talk show. But I couldn't agree more. Those positive stories, those real people, I think will ultimately be his undoing as well, especially on the debate stage.
You know, I want to bring a different dimension to this question about healthcare, and let's take a step back and think about what happened in 2016. If you look at the blue wall, effectively, we lost, 1 million votes from 12 to 16, but 800,000 of those lost votes came from small town, rural parts of those states. And when you're in the small town parts of the state, we were in the Pennsylvania 18 special election for Connor Lamb, and you're out in the ex-urban counties, and this one woman says to us, lifelong Republican, I'm 1 ER visit away from losing everything. Mm-hmm. All right? This is Jessica's grandmother's story. Mm-hmm. These folks are experiencing the healthcare crisis in a fundamentally different way than those of us in the big urban population centers mm-hmm. are. And so you talk about it being Donald Trump's kryptonite. It's his kryptonite, especially in the places where he ran up the score, because accessibility and proximity mm-hmm.
Combined
with cost are just, it's a killer.
Like in the closing of rural hospitals, right? I would add on to what Matt said. And so there's cost related to getting to a hospital, mm-hmm. and people are, there are, in South Carolina, I think we'll hear about African-American women dying mm-hmm. or during pregnancy, and just the access. And I think the other, just people dying from things as basic as car accidents because of the, if you talk to people in rural America, the number of people who have family members or people in their people like very close to them who have died because of a simple car accident, because of like crumbling infrastructure, and then a lack of ability to get someone to a hospital center is significant. And I think we'll see that in some of the rural populations as we go forward.
We did a lot of research around marriage equality and LGBT equality for a very long time, and one of the things that had moved people was more and more people coming out and then knowing someone that they were thinking of when they were kind of thinking through, should this person be able to get married? And I feel like as we've had more and more people talking about their healthcare experiences and either pre-existing conditions or their experience in actually physically accessing healthcare, it seems like everyone kind of knows someone, and it's really started to change the conversation. What didn't we ask that we should have asked? What should we ask for next time? We're going to do this poll over and over again, and we're really trying to understand what's going on here. David got to ask everything he wanted to already, so. But what would you three suggest we take a look at going forward?
You guys are smarter than I am on this stuff.
I did figure, Matt, you talk like millions of voters every year. Yeah. I think some of probably what Matt does. Like I'd be interested in just hearing open-ended responses mm-hmm. about what are you looking for specifically to figure out language, what issues are top of mind for you to figure out things that may not be on the national radar, right? Like there was a gap in Social Security when I was on the ground in Iowa in 2004. And so these people who called themselves notch babies, where they were missing in Social Security, that was a huge thing for a particular segment of the electorate. So I think there are things in some of these early states that we may not be identifying inside some of the polling without open-ended responses.
I love open ends. I couldn't agree more because they tell you everything. Look, I think one of the things that I would be interested in if I got to do this is especially sort of in an online way where you can have candidates' bios and have people underline parts of what they really like about them. Mm-hmm. You know, what traits are you seeing that you really like? What part of them are you sort of most drawn to? I just think as we arc towards the general, and it's sort of interesting that in order to get through our primary, you have to go through the gauntlet of the debates. Whether you like the setup or you don't like the setup, that's not the issue. The debates will be a gauntlet, but I think the debates with Trump, I think you have to go through that to be prepared to be on the national stage with him. And just the way he does things, the way he can dissect people, the way he can take what you have and turn it against you, I think is something our candidates are going to have to be very well rooted in. Talk about being comfortable with yourself. This is going to be the ultimate test of being comfortable with yourself, to be honest. And so I just would be very interested in the pieces of their bios, the pieces of their personal stories, their characteristics that actually move the electorate towards them. I'd be very interested in. And then I would just keep an is on the general brand as itself. Who speaks for the party? Where does AOC fit into this? Where does Pelosi fit into all this? Like, who is sort of the spokesperson for the party is something that I would just keep an eye on, at least as we get closer towards the general.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I love this idea of open ends connected to a closed-ended question. And you start to see the tensions in terms of how people, when they're asked a follow-up question, start to think about the response they just gave. I would love to see a little bit more of that. I would also love to see a bit more beyond just the Twitter question. How are people consuming information? We are, I mean, last time I checked, I think Sinclair has 7 out of the 11 broadcast properties in central and southwestern Ohio. And we know what that means in terms of the amount of local earned media folks are going to see that carries our perspective. The more we start to better understand the fundamentals of how people are consuming information and judging the different candidates, that's what's going to tell us what attributes of candidate post for president that you like, that makes you think that she will win. I'm not putting your name in nomination.
I'm
but
not announcing today.
Do you have an announcement you'd like to make?
While not directly answering your question about what to put on a future poll, I think one thing that is interesting to us as we analyze the Democratic primary electorate looking forward is the difference between people who are focused on policy and specific policies, whether it be on the economy and help for the middle class, or whether it be on health care or education, teacher pay, all the other stuff that you see them talking about, versus the people that really aren't that focused on policy, but they really want character. They want someone they connect with, who resonates with them, who they could trust to have their back, and they don't even have to hear what they're saying on particular policies because they know that they're that candidate will have their back and represent them and average Americans and not the wealthy. So the issue that I look at going forward is, what is that division between people that are really going to be reading the websites and kind of listening to policy versus those people who are going to say, I'm going to go with my gut here, and my gut says this candidate or that candidate is the one that is always going to be someone that I could trust and who has empathy and compassion, and someone that has all these characteristics that Donald Trump doesn't.
That's true. I mean, a lot of the historical studies show that people vote for whatever is the opposite of the thing they have. So I would say if we had someone with character, that'd probably be good at this point. So we've been talking a lot about the primary, but obviously you all know a lot about how to win general elections too. And if you got to have the nominee for like 30 seconds before they walk on the debate stage with Donald Trump, what would your advice be?
I mean, I can go. So I would say, don't talk about policy. Don't talk about words that people don't think mean anything. And this is very similar to what we say to state legislative candidates. There's a candidate who is running in New Mexico, and the current New Mexico House Speaker, Brian Egoff, sat him down and said, well, why are you running? Mm-hmm. And he said, I'm running because I want to improve the state of the economy inside my community. Okay, well, who cares, right? Like that doesn't actually mean anything, right? So he said, tell me actually why you're running. And he said, here's why I'm running. My son moved to Phoenix and brought my granddaughter with him. I don't see my granddaughter as much as I'd like to. When I was on the county council, I brought 18 jobs to this town, and I want this town to be a place where I want this community to be a place where people can stay and their kids can stay and raise their kids. And and we need to bring more jobs to the community to do that. I miss doing that, and that's why I want to run. And so then he would say that every day at the door, right? So I would say to the presidential candidate, tell us why you're running. Tell us in real language why you're running. Don't put out a suite of policies to lead with and tell us about your vision of what the United States should be. Hopefully it can be a place where people can stay in their communities, raise their families, and their kids can live there, or whatever you think it should be. But stay away from buzzwords, policies, and words that could mean anything to anybody.
I'm getting more and more on the Jessica Post for President train. That was very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so when the presidential nominee calls me and says, what should I say? Not if. You know, I mean, I think the fundamentals are ignore Donald Trump. You're not running to win his vote. If you are, you're in the wrong business. You know, you actually have to make a compelling case for yourself why voters should choose you. They've already gotten so much information about Donald Trump. They've made their decision on him already. I think we often make the mistake of trying to address the wrong audience here. And so start to tell the story about wanting your granddaughter to be closer to home. Tell the story about, you know, being the 50-year-old or meeting the 50-year-old dad in Delaware County, Ohio, who is now a stay-at-home dad because once he got laid off, he couldn't find a way back into the workforce. Really relate to people that you want their vote, ask them for their vote, and suddenly you might get a few votes.
David,
I would just tell a nominee that it's really important to express what your values are. Lead from a discussion of the values that you hold and that we all hold as Americans, the values we have in common, and explain how those values guide your goals for the country.
Yeah, I agree with everything. I would just say three quick things to them, because I'm a Democrat. You got to have things in threes, right? Your bio and your personal story is going to be 99% of this. The values, why you are actually doing it. You've got to, especially in the debate, you're going to have to anchor yourself in a way that, and I think to some degree we all remember sort of what Clinton had to go through on the debate stage with him and him walking behind her, and just so rooting that. If you've got more than 2 or 3 issues, you probably have too many. So, you know, corruption, paychecks, and healthcare. If it's outside of that, check in. And then the third thing is and I don't know how you folks feel about this, but America does best when we are big. And we do best when we have something we are shooting towards. We have something, we as a country just do better when we point to the moon and say we're going to go. We've already been there, so maybe it's Mars, or it's curing cancer, or it's something. But like, just as the country needs and I'm sure our smart pollster at the end here can talk about this, but we do need some healing. We do need some things that unify people. And I think with Trump in particular, he is not ever going to be able to stand there and say, you know what, I'm going to bring everybody together. And it's my playbook. And so I just think having a grander sort of vision, I think, is something that will be helpful to them.
Let's open it up to all of the wonderful people here in the audience here. Aaron's going to come around with the microphones.
Hi, Alan Rivlin, Zen Political Research. And there is a conventional wisdom that's taking hold in the Democratic Party right now, and it's very much in evidence on this panel, that says healthcare is a winning issue for Democrats. Because Obamacare is popular, it's how we won the 2018 election, and Donald Trump's an idiot for bringing up the topic. Wrong. We are very vulnerable on health care in 2020, and your poll helps explain what the problem is. I'm a veteran pollster from Clinton Care, Obamacare, and one thing 30 years of polling on health care tells us is what's popular is more coverage for less cost, and what's unpopular is paying for health care. And right now, the Medicare for all is in the sweet spot. It's 3 words that allow somebody who supports it to think that they're supporting more coverage for less cost. Donald Trump just claimed the same mantle. He said, I'm going to give you more coverage for less cost and cover pre-existing conditions. And the Democratic nominee is either going to be somebody who's for the status quo, or therefore something radical that takes away health care for millions of people that they like. And those two sides are going to be beating each other up for the next year and a half. And Donald Trump's going to say, it's simple. They don't know whether they're for something you can't afford or you're for taking away the care you like. I know what I'm for, more coverage for less cost, and I'm going to cover pre-existing conditions. And we're going to say you have no credibility, and where's your plan, and all of that. But your poll shows that if Obamacare is so popular, I mean, Obamacare is popular because people like the coverage, but they hate the cost. And the biggest issue for Democratic primary voters is lower the cost of my health care, and that's Obamacare, or it's private insurance that people like, or it's government care. But they've got a big problem with it, and we're not, I mean, I'm not saying we can't solve this issue, but we certainly shouldn't be assuming it away and thinking he's an idiot for fighting on this turf.
Right. Reactions?
I mean, Alan, it's great to see you. I agree that I definitely agree that we have a liability on the escalating cost of healthcare premiums. I think that's concerning. That's certainly something we've seen Republicans elevate in the states, and I'm sure folks have seen this. I do think that that we have to anchor it in our values and in terms of the cost of healthcare. And I do think the framing of the Medicaid for all versus Obamacare, people go online and they think that they're signing up for like Trump care when they sign up for basics. I think so we have to be able to cut through some of the terminology and just talk about what are the core things we believe in, which is affordable healthcare or no cost healthcare for all, and that people shouldn't be paying tons of money out of pocket.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a downside to the argument, but I think it's a line that's very walkable. I think issues around pre-existing conditions, issues around the age tax that was put forward in 2018 that Republicans overwhelmingly supported, I think provide a lot of sort of weight behind it. The other thing you got to remember is there is a transactional relationship once you're in the general election with the electorate on protection in particular of Medicare. If Trump really wants to have a fight over Medicare and Social Security and what his tax cuts actually mean, bring it. And if healthcare is part of that conversation, happy to have that conversation. His tax cuts jeopardize Medicare and Social Security. Period. Happy to have that conversation on the stage. Happy to. That's a winning issue for us. By the way, the Democrats can win. I'm interested in your opinion on this. We can win on the tax fight. We have to be bigger than we have been in the past. So, again, the same way with healthcare, a socialist playbook's not going to work in any way, shape, or form. A very pragmatic one will absolutely work.
I'm not sure I agree with the underlying premise, just because we're seeing such a consistent skyrocketing in the share of people who are saying healthcare is their top concern and the correlate with partisanship. What I will say is that any candidate who recognizes the very specific challenges that people face as it relates to healthcare affordability and access and describes those challenges is going to connect. People know where they eat. They are going to understand to a fare thee well what a $125,000 hospital bill, and that's like, what, 6 days or something, in an ER visit. They're going to get it at that level. I don't think Donald Trump can speak to voters in those terms. Obamacare is never really that popular as a concept, but all the stuff that it came with and improving on the stuff that it came with was always far more popular. Speak to the particulars of people's lived experiences, and I think you move past that. As Dan was saying, it's a pretty walkable line.
I would just add, I agree with what's been said, and I would just add that I agree there are vulnerabilities that the Democratic Party has, especially if they get into an internal fight about single-payer or Medicare for all versus improving ACA. But historically, the Republican Party has never had an advantage over the Democrats on the issue of health care. Voters nationally always feel the Democrats have had more of their back when it comes to ensuring that people have lower cost health care coverage. I agree that it's something that has to be navigated, but in general, if you look at if Democrats continue to point out that Republicans have always been trying to repeal Obamacare and their replacement has been what? Do voters know what Republicans stand for? I mean, maybe, like crossing state lines, something like that. Maybe that cuts through. But generally, in the research that we've done, they have not trusted the Republicans to have their back on health care.
You talk about the importance of candidates listening to people and going out. I'm concerned that the early states, which are not just going to be what the media is going to be reporting on, is going to be what the candidates are going to be focusing on, are not the states that we had the problem with the blue wall from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin. And how do we address that problem that we're going to need to rebuild that blue wall if we're going to beat Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I'll just say is when I have co-presented with our counterpart at the Republican State Leadership Committee, he said the Republicans thought the path back to power was to go to rebuild to 270 electoral votes, was to win back state legislatures and then dismantle voting rights, collective bargaining, and take things apart. So they really understand the strategy of the blue wall. And after the 2016 election, our Republican counterpart said to me, like, "Are you surprised? We've been punching holes in your blue wall for years," and they have been, right? So I do think that so that's just sort of an aside that the Republican Party deeply understands the strategy and that we have to win these states. I think that the way to maybe it's just elevating the voices. If you think about states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, they're concerned about exactly what some of the people in Iowa are concerned about, that I articulated earlier, that their kids can't stay there and work, that their kids are leaving for economic opportunities, that the costs of the roads and rural infrastructure are not great. And so I think there are some candidates. Klobuchar just introduced an infrastructure plan yesterday. So hopefully those things help us weave between what primary voters are asking about and what swing voters in the blue wall are concerned about. But it is going to be a challenge for sure. And I'd love to hear from the smart voices on this panel.
Well, I'll give a comment anyway. Jessica, I think you're raising something that the calendar in terms of the outsized effect of California. Like, we have no way of really processing what that's really going to do, because that's all the marbles right there, and finding your niche in a state that has this open primary process is going to it's going to distort outcomes in ways that I can't predict. That said, Jessica is exactly right. Get down to the fundamentals of where people exist, and you don't have to worry about, are you too far left? Are you adequately centrist? Like, that is a convenience, and so we shouldn't allow our labels to confuse the concept. The concept that we really need to ground ourselves in is these roads in western Pennsylvania that are just not passable, and you have a record number of deaths on one particular highway leading in and out of Pittsburgh. Like, that's what people see in the local newspaper.
The other point I'd like to make is I do think that there is something that we have to focus on with regard to the mechanics of campaigning, meaning that looking into the general 2020, Democrats have to get more out of their base votes in places like Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, and at the same time appeal to the small town and rural voters in those states so that they're not going 90-10 for Donald Trump. And I think sometimes it's a mistake to think that we have to choose one or the other, because we should be doing both, appealing, turning out the vote in those urban cores, and still going to the rural voters, small town voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and appealing to them on pocketbook voters, on pocketbook issues and health care and those sorts of things, to win some of those back for the Democratic candidate.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to come back in on this, because David is exactly right. Folks, we can't afford a small victory here. Like, 270 votes, electoral votes, just will not do. We've had a norm-breaking presidency on an order of magnitude that I don't think any of us could have imagined. If we want to reestablish democratic norms and really take control of our democracy, then playing for just enough votes so that you're cutting it real close, you cannot govern that way. Do you think Mitch McConnell is going to suddenly play nice and start filling judicial vacancies? It's not going to happen. We have to go for all the marbles, especially with redistricting more or less on the ballot, and run up the score in small towns where we haven't even tried to compete, at least in a decade, because the gerrymander was so effective.
Yeah, look, I agree. Part of the way we won back the House is in 2016 we had 40 viable congressional races that we were fighting in. 2018 we had 80 plus to 90, sort of depending on your viability. I've said it a couple of times, just as a party, and I always sort of stood up straighter when I say it, we just need to be bigger. And look, there is a day where the road leads through Georgia, it leads through Arizona, where it leads through where Florida sort of is there. The Almost. But you give them no quarter, and you go and fight everywhere. Number one, and the party needs to do that. Two. As part of another project I am doing, we just got done doing focus groups in suburban Michigan, just outside of just outside of Pittsburgh, and in Wisconsin. And we, as a party, need to keep a very close eye on what the brand of the party is, what is breaking through, what are actual swing voters saying. That blue wall is ground zero. I think everybody knows that. And just as the party itself moves forward, we're all like, the primary is sort of the big sort of sexy fight, but we have to keep a very, very close eye on that blue wall for the general. And I will tell you, what those focus groups showed us was, I've said it a couple of times, the corruption to paychecks and access to affordable health care, in particular cost of prescription drugs, is just an underlying challenge. The other challenge that we have, and I'd be interested in y'all's opinion on this, but just looking at Trump, just looking at his favorability rating, just looking at his job approval rating, he is much more complicated than that in terms of voters actually making their own decision to vote for him. And so some of the traditional sort of vital statistics we look at to judge vulnerability don't quite fit with him.
Right, because he had the lowest levels ever when he was elected. So why would we think that that would be the indicator now? And more people said he was unqualified to be president, and that's where he is right now.
But a lot of these voters would then turn around and say, but he is trying to give me a fair shot. And he is like, you know what, it's worth a little bit of pain on tariffs if it means we're sticking it to China. And there is this sort of, I'm the biggest guy in the room, and I'm giving you a fair shot thing to him that people kind of like. It's complicated.
We have time for one more question right over here. Go ahead.
Same from the Atlantic. I'm interested in how you think, there's no question on the poll directly about this, but I'm interested in how you think Democrats should talk about Trump and race. I think there are a lot of Democratic primary voters who want to hear exactly what Stacey Abrams said the other day to Dan Balz. He is a racist, xenophobic, misogynistic homophobe. That's how she described Trump in 4 words. But I'm interested in, particularly in light of your focus groups, do you think that terming him a racist, do you think that will help in a general election by making more, perhaps, upper middle class voters uncomfortable being associated with him? Or do you think it is problematic to term him a racist and a xenophobe in the sense that his voters will view it as attacking them in those same terms?
Wow, that's a heck of a question to end on. I think it depends who the room is, and I think it depends who you're talking to be perfectly honest with you. I think it's important to understand that, in particular in the Midwest, non-college educated voters, they don't like him. They're not crazy about what he brings to the table. And they understand that Republicans generally are for sort of big business first. But the second spot in line behind big business for these voters is them. The second spot in line for the Democratic Party is not them in their eyes. It is a person of color. It is a woman. It is, all of these other things that for them the world has just changed and makes them very, very uncomfortable. And I think it is just something that's why I sort of said earlier, I think we need a unifying sort of healing look at the country that look, ultimately at the DCCC at the end, we did a ton of research on negative, kids in cages, reason to go participate, right? The xenophobic stuff, or positive. And in every piece of research we had, the first piece was, it was known, right? There's nothing about that you can tell people that they don't know. And this is just my own opinion, but for us it worked. We chose to go positive. We chose to be bigger. We chose reasons to participate. Voting needed to feel good. You vote for something, not necessarily against something. You're going to have to vote against him in a lot of places, but there had to be a positive underlying something. But how those swing voters, especially in the Midwest, view the party itself and who gets put in line is something the party just generally needs to be very aware of. Because he's going to stand there and he's going to say, who is fighting for you? I'm taking on China. I'm willing to take on the Russians, and they're lying to you about what I did, and I'm willing to fight for you. That is exactly what he is going to do. And the party needs, if we get tripped up on all the pieces of the larger umbrella of the party, we're going to get lost along the way. I don't know if that's the popular answer, but.
Yeah, I mean, race questions tend to be loaded questions, right? voters already have enough information to know where Donald Trump is, whether they think he's a xenophobe, a misogynist, etc. And that feels good sometimes to get it out. But let's take a step back and think about our broader history. We have a long-standing American tradition where race matters greatly in how people self-identify. But at the same time, what our experience tells us is that there's nothing that precludes a candidate from saying Black Lives Matter, and that's real, but jobs in Lima, Ohio matter too. You say both, and suddenly folks in Lima are hearing it. And oh, by the way, a bunch of folks in Lima are black. You know, we have this kind of false dichotomy between being able to be socially in line with the progressive base and thinking that that is therefore going to alienate the votes we need in, you know, small town Midwest America to win. It's just not so.
I do think that voters will, of all stripes, will reward directness, and I hope I'm not stepping on what you were going to say, David. But I think voters to just say, like, I'm going to call it like I see it. That's been part of Trump's appeal, though sort of unbelievably racist, I will say, in his approach. But I do think that voters of all stripes will reward people being direct. And then I really agree with both Matt and Dan about saying, but also this, right? So, but just in a very direct way.
I think that voters out there who agree with what Stacey Abrams said are already opposing Donald Trump. I'm not sure that phraseology wins additional voters for the Democratic candidate. In our focus groups, there's a real bit of texture to the degree to which Democratic voters say the most important thing I want is to defeat Donald Trump, and at the same time saying, I don't want a candidate who's going to spend all their time talking about Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. They say this at the exact same time. They say, I want a Democratic candidate that's going to speak to my issues, that's going to talk about salaries and health care and the issues that they care about. And to me, it's not as much labels of what Donald Trump is. It's more of what he stands for with regard to his character, whether it be bullying, whether it be this crudeness, whether it be kind of a mean, aggressive, vengeful attack that he has constantly day to day that's causing mothers to say, I don't want my kids to watch the news because who knows what they're going to say on it, that I want to turn down the volume on. And sometimes the president uses that language and he uses its tone, and we are not that. In this country, we don't want this guy to represent leadership and tell our kids that this is the best we can be. That's the kind of angle that I think is a little bit more effective than kind of the, calling him the labels that you were quoting.
Well, we're going to let David have the last word since it was his poll, and
those were my last words.
Those were your last words, yes. But I would invite you all we put the entire poll up on the website, and we will be having more every single quarter coming up. So I'm hoping that next time we have this conversation, we have like 30 presidential candidates in the race, so we can mix it up a little bit more. But I'd like to ask you to help me thank all of these really smart people for having this great conversation.
Thank you for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.